Let me clarify something. I feel like I need to say something. I feel like in so many ways I've gone over to the lighter side of things. And part of the reason I say that is because sometimes over the years that I've been ordained in the Lutheran Church, I've always struggled with doctrinal issues, and I've had many conversations and sometimes arguments with people and colleagues about doctrine. And I came to realize as an ELCA pastor that doctrines are simply teachings that we proclaim with faith from here, and not always assenting. Not assenting from a heart is different than believing all the technicalities of a bunch of doctrines and confessions. And while they are important and vital, I've also always tried to stretch them in order to allow entry points in different ways into those teachings. And so it's easier to do that here because there are not so many obstacles, and so I deeply appreciate that. So anyway, I hope that I just wanted to let you know I don't feel like I'm on the dark side here. It's more on the lighter side. So do you want to put that first slide on? Thank you. I hope it was a little fun for Davey to put this together this week. So there is a teaching from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy called the Seventh Generation. It's an Iroquoian-speaking confederacy of people of Native Americans and First Nations people in Canada. And that's a map of sort of the original, well, if you go back to the 1700s, this is what you might have experienced if you were traveling around the central part of the east and the eastern coast of our land here, of their land. That's who was there at one point. Around, and I'm gonna try to pronounce these words correctly today. I'm not a native Iroquoian speaker, and my Ojibwe skills are less than what they should be. My wife is much better at it than I am. But around 1700, the Haudenosaunee territory extended north into Ontario and Quebec, and south into present-day Virginia and Kentucky and the Ohio Valley. From east to west, the League of People was composed of Mohawk and Oneida and Onondaga and Cayuga and Seneca nations. And then in about 1722, and some of these dates are a little bit flexible here, I think, the Iroquoian-speaking Tuscarora people, having migrated because of conflicts that they were having in the south, they migrated northward from the Carolinas, and they joined the Confederacy, which was known as the Five Nations, and it became known as the Six Nations. So you can put on the next one there, Davey, please. The Haudenosaunee means people of the long house. And its name, and it is the name by which the Six Nations people refer to themselves. And as typical of the way we now name groups of people, some scholars and some linguists consider Iroquois as a derogatory name, just like some people consider Chippewa or Sioux as derogatory names that were adopted from the traditional, maybe, enemies of the Haudenosaunee people. This is one of the oldest participatory democracies, and this confederacy has persisted into the 21st century. All right, so it's very old, and it continues to function as a organization. That's why I was trying to describe what a constitution can mean, because this was pre-written days. But their original constitution dates between 1570 and 1600, and it's based on the great law of peace, which was conceived and given in a vision to a person named Dagandaweeda. His name means he the thinker. Dagandaweeda is known also as the great peacemaker. And as always, there's a story, or many stories, and I've read a number of ones that are basically tell the same story with some different details, but part of the mythology, and I use that word as a way of understanding what it means to have a meaning. A myth is a meaning. It's not necessarily based on fact, just like it comes from here and here, but it comes from the heart. Part of the mythology or story is that Dagandaweeda was a man who separated himself from the Huron Indian people in what we know today as Ontario. And he separated himself from them to go east and address the needs of the tribes to his east who were warring with each other. And it is told, and you might hear that phrase as you listen to old stories, it is told that he was born, now listen carefully to this, it is told that he was born of a virgin mother, and also that he had a speech problem, making it hard for him to communicate. And as soon as I heard that, I'm thinking, oh, Jesus, Moses, same kind of thing. Born of a virgin mother, speech problems, deeply important, very important people who had a message to convey. So think Jesus, think Moses, think about mythology that gives meaning to the unique and important people and teachings and cultures that then create our traditions and sometimes create our doctrines. They create our written constitutions and things like that. Well, Dagandaweeda gave his vision of peace to the Mohawk people, but because his speech was unconvincing. Remember, he had a speech problem. It was hard to communicate. He then decided to prove through his action the veracity or the truth of his vision. And so it is told that he climbed a tall pine tree that was over a deep gorge that had been cut by the Mohawk River. And then he asked the people to cut the tree down with him in it. And they accepted the test. They cut down the tree, and Dagandaweeda then plunged into the rapids below. And a few moments later, he mysteriously climbed out of the gorge completely unharmed. So there's a bit of a miracle story there also. The Mohawks then were amazed, and they were convinced of his vision for peace. But convincing their foes, the Onondagas, would be another matter. And the story then takes another mythological turn. So Dagandaweeda met a deeply depressed wanderer, and I like to capitalize the W on that because that's his title. He was a wanderer. He was an Onondaga man whose wife and 7 daughters had been killed in the senseless violence between the tribes. But there's a twist, there's a catch here. Their lives were not taken by their enemies, but their lives were taken by the hands of their own chief, Ododaro, who ruled with an iron fist and was said to be an evil man whose hair crawled with snakes. Some more mythological understandings coming in. So the depressed and the heartbroken wanderer who had lost his family was also a very articulate man, and Dagandaweeda taught him his vision for peace and the importance of loving everyone, including your enemies, including those who do you deep injustices in your life. So the wanderer's heart then was transformed, and he underwent a miraculous healing, and he became Dagandaweeda's loyal disciple and his spokesperson. So together with Dagandaweeda, this wanderer approached the evil Ododaro, who was responsible for his family's deaths. And through his then passionate and articulate speech, this wanderer was able to convert Ododaro into a dedicated believer and follower of the vision of the great peace. And in so doing, it is said that the wanderer was then able to comb the snakes out of Ododaro's hair and thus received the name Hiawatha, which means he who combs. So now, with the Mohawks and the Onondagas as the nucleus, then the Cayugas and the Oneidas and the Senecas saw the wisdom of joining this confederacy that came to be known as the League of Five Nations. It was then that Dagondawita, through and together with the wanderer, gave this speech. I, Dagondawita, with the Confederate lords of the Five Nations, plant the tree of the great peace. I plant it in your territory, Orodaro, and in the land of the Onondaga Nation, in the territory of which you are the fire keeper. We spread the soft, white feathery down of the globe thistle as seats for you and your cousin lords. If anyone of any nation outside the Five Nations shall desire to obey the laws of the great peace, they may trace the roots to their source, and they shall be welcome. The shadow of the tree will be pleasant and beautiful, and never again shall people walk in fear. All the peoples of humankind will dwell there in peace and in tranquility, and we will have one head, one tongue, and one blood in our bodies. And at the top of the tree sits Skagina, the eagle, who watches always and will warn us when she sees approaching that which brings destruction and death. So I, Dagondawita, and the Confederate lords of the Five Nations now uproot the tallest pine tree, and into the hole we cast all the weapons of war, and we bury them from sight forever, and we plant again the tree. And now with his mission complete, Dagondawita said, now I shall be seen no more and go where no one can follow. And he got into a luminous white canoe on the shore of Lake Onondaga and paddled toward the setting sun, never to be seen again. It's a beautiful story. Another perspective says their desire to stand together as Six Nations was partly against a colonizing invasion, and partly what helped the tribes unite in common council that was composed of clan and village chiefs, and each tribe then had one vote, and unanimity was required for decisions, and the laws, which we call a constitution, and perhaps they did too, are then divided, now that they are written down, into 117 articles, and the United Iroquois or Haudenosaunee nations are symbolized by an eastern pine tree called the Tree of Peace. And here is an image of a pine tree, and that is what you might see on a Six Nations flag. So perhaps you have heard this, but many, and this is all disputed by scholars and in academic circles. Many years later, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and George Washington would all become familiar with the Iroquois Confederacy and its great law of peace. And in part, the European examples of governance that they found, they said they found no model to unite the colonies or frame a democratic constitution. And some historians claim that in the Iroquois system, a clear blueprint was drawn from which to begin the work that lay ahead of the founders of what we know as the United States of America. So then it was finally in 1987 or 1988, I've seen both dates mentioned, the United States Congress actually passed a resolution recognizing the influence of the Iroquois League upon the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that we call our own. So now that's all kind of a background for what I wanted to tell you today. Now I'm gonna say something a little bit bizarre here. How many of you remember Looney Tunes and Porky Pig? What was his line at the end of the cartoons?
That's all, folks.
Yeah, well, this is not all, folks, okay? That's not what I came to tell you. So, that's all, folks. This is not all, folks. One of the teachings in this great history of this Iroquois Confederacy, one of the great teachings is from the great peacemaker Maawanji'iding, is of the 7th generation. And I have heard this numerous times in the past, but recently, I think it was last spring at some point, there was a speaker that the Keweenaw Bay Indian folks invited to come up. His name is James Vukolich, and I have no idea how to pronounce his Ojibwe name, so I'm not going to try. But this is in part a reflection on that. Now, the way that I heard years ago the teaching of the 7th generation was very simple, and it's this. He told them that in every one of your decisions and deliberations, as an individual and as a family or as a community, as a region, in every one of your decisions and deliberations, you must think 7 generations into the future. And when you have a decision to make, then remove yourself, your vested interest, that's what that means. Remove your vested interest, remove your family's vested interest, your communities, wider than that, your region, and all vested interests then go away. And all you get then, or what you get then, is silence. When all interested parties are cleared away, then imagine a child 7 generations later. Weigh your decision with that child in mind. Is it good for them? And then you will know what to do. So there's a deeper way to understand this, and this is what we picked up from the linguist James Vukolich, who is an Ojibwe person from Minnesota. And this will be an interesting thing to think about as if you can remember some of this for next week when Carol Grafford is going to be here and do a talk about some Buddhist understandings. But James Vukolich teaches this. The first generation is I. It's me, it's myself. And that's what made me think of Carol's talk next week. So the first generation is I, me, and myself. And then, going back in time, my parents and my grandparents before them and my great-grandparents. And there is a word in the Ojibwe language for this, and it is Indanaku-Bijigan. All right? You can put on the next slide there, Dave. Indanaku-Bijigan, and it's taken me a while to remember that, but once it gets burned in your head, it's not that hard, can simply mean ancestor. That's what the word means. One who lived here as long as thousands of years ago. Any ancestors, Indanaku-Bijigan. But in Ojibwe understanding, it's also the word for great-grandchild. Isn't that interesting? The word means generations past, and it means generations future. But that's not all, folks, okay? The root of the word in Indanaku-Bijigan is anik. And there's a great teaching about how this language, there are many great teachings about how this language is put together, and a lot of it is built on the root of a word, and the preface, the prefix, and the suffixes all combine to change the meaning of the word. The root of the word is anik, which means to be connected. It means to be interlinked, to be in sequence like a bike chain. And then James Vukolich says, to spiritually translate the word, and of course there is going to be a spiritual translation, it means I am inextricably interconnected to everyone and everything else. And it's all there in that one word. All generations, past, present, and future, are interconnected. So whatever affects them whoever them is, affects us, and whatever affects us affects those who have not yet been born. And I am inextricably interconnected to you. I do not exist alone. I'm not saying, they don't say, I do not exist. They say, I do not exist alone. I am a link in the chain that goes all the way back and all the way forward, inextricably connected to all my relatives. And in that way, in a deeply mystical way, I am all my relatives, and all my relatives are me. That's just beautiful understanding. So an important understanding of what this means for us as we then seek to build healing relationships with our indigenous neighbors. And that's why I wore this shirt today. People of the Heart Water Walk is a group of people that walks together, and it's not just Native folks. It's a broad group of people that walks for the water here and across our nation. It happens all over the place. So, but one can also think, as we understand what it means to seek to build relationships, and I would invite people specifically to think of boarding schools and the generations affected by them, the past, present, and the future. One of the teachings is that who we are, who you are, and who we are together has been passed down from generations before us. We are learning also that trauma doesn't just change us psychologically. It doesn't just change us spiritually. It actually changes our blood memory, changes our DNA. It affects us physically. Trauma affects people physically, and then we then pass those changes down to future generations, which is a very scary thing, but it's also very understandable. Intergenerational trauma then is like a rosary. For example, we have inherited the pain of our ancestors, both those who were traumatized by, for example, boarding schools, and those ancestors of ours who created and supported those same schools and traumatized other people. So they were traumatized, and those that they created schools for were also traumatized. And when we recognize that we are suffering then from inherited trauma, we can then begin to heal it. And our purpose then becomes how we choose to free ourselves. And this is also very helpful, I think, when understanding the way things like alcoholism and abuse are passed down from generation to generation. And perhaps you understand that intimately, perhaps you've just heard about it, but it is so very true that the trauma that happens is passed down to future generations. But James Vukolich also says this: it is important to note that we do not just inherit trauma. We are witnessing today a great strength and a great resilience in spite of some of our ancestors' efforts to wipe out a people and a way of being. Strength and resilience are also passed down as well to the next generation. So a new rosary then can be strung with new or actually very old beads, old ways of being, like this teaching of the seventh generation, as we seek to understand the truth of the past and the present and the future. And I like during the children's moment for all ages when the word truth came up. It's just a powerful, powerful understanding. In the Ojibwe language, I have learned that truth is active. It's more a verb than a noun. The active and the ongoing truth is that we are all connected, and we're realizing how that works. We need each other to survive. The moment we realize that, our awakening can become a healing catalyst for both colonized and colonizers. So use whatever example you want in there. The moment we make the decision to change, we are choosing to heal the present and future generations. Intergenerational trauma can actually stop here. And it is our responsibility, and this, I say this as a white male person, It is our responsibility to identify our own need for healing. That means I need to be aware of my own responsibility for all things in the past, present, and the future. And then here's the last, but that's not all, folks. There's one more thing that I find just incredibly exciting about this teaching. It's the coolest thing about this whole thing. In a deep and sometimes obscure or hard to identify way, the teaching says, the seventh generation, this works backward in time too. It doesn't just work forward for healing in the future. It works backward too. Truth seeking and truth telling is also about healing past generations. This is an opportunity then for those in the present to heal those who are no longer with us, to heal the spirits from the burdens that they were inflicted with and still carry. Acknowledging and owning the sacred responsibility of the present and the future is how we begin to heal the wounds our ancestors suffered in the past. Seeking that truth, then, is to act in a way that is beneficial to all our relatives, past, present, and future. And the Lakota word for that is Taushpe. It's all my relatives. So, with that in mind, then, if you want to put on the last slide, Davey, there are some things happening this next weekend, and I brought copies of a schedule here that's up there. If you would like to find out about the powwow that's happening at KBIC this coming weekend, beginning on Friday evening, the information is here. On Wednesday, there is a 16 or 17 mile water walk from Pequaming back to the lighthouse on the Ojibwe Powwow grounds, and that begins at 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning, and we walk until we get there, and there will be a feast. There's also the third annual Children's Remembrance Walk that is walking in support of those who suffered and died in boarding schools, and we begin at Assinins and walk to the powwow grounds. And there's also a link to a presentation that James Vukolich did at Lake State, which is very similar to the one I heard here at KBIC. So I'm going to put these, I guess, on the back table by the sign-up list, and you can take one if you want, or it will be hopefully online also. So thank you for the time today to talk about this very exciting and very important thing to me, anyway. So we'll have another hymn.